So today's daf is one long cheshbon, one long flow. So let's restart the parak. We'll see how you feel in a half hour. So let's restart the parak. Daf kufam and beis. The Mishnah begins like this: Menachos v'hanasachim shenitmu. If you have the flour, the oil, or the wine of menachos or nesachim that become tameh, so the question is, can you redeem them? So the general rule is that you're able to redeem something that has kedushas hadomim, kedushas hapeh, not kedushas haguf. Now, when it comes to flour, when I say I have a bag of flour and I say this flour is going to be used for the mincha, it imbues within it kedushas domim. It has a small level of holiness. Once it's placed in a kli sharis, it has a higher level of holiness. It says the Mishnah, actually kitcher bekli, if the mincha, the flour became tameh before it was placed in a kli sharis, yesh lem pidyon, then you could redeem it. You could transfer that holiness onto cash. But misha kitcher bekli, but once it's placed in a kli sharis, ein lahem pidyon. There is no pidyon. Now, the Mishnah then says, ha'ofos, regarding birds, ha'etzim, regarding wood for the mizbeach, valavona and frankincense, ukli sharis, and a kli sharis, misha nitmu, that become tameh, so ein lahem pidyon, they are not able to be redeemed. Now that's a little interesting. Why? The Gemara will explain why they do not have pidyon. Now, so here's the question. The Gemara, the Mishnah, for whatever reason, assumes that the oifus, the birds, the frankincense, the wood for the mizbeach, and the kli shares have the status of the highest level of kedusha. The highest level of kedusha, you cannot have a pidyon. You don't have a pidyon. Now, we do find with kedusha saguf, the highest level of kedusha, we do find a pidyon, and that's with an animal, right? If you have an animal that you dedicate as a carbon, the second you say it's a carbon, it automatically has kedusha saguf. The halacha is that if it has a mum, you could redeem it. So what's the difference between an animal with a mum that can be redeemed than the birds or wood or frankincense? Why is it that you can't redeem this? It says the Mishnah, Shaloi nemar pidyon ela bebehema. This ability to redeem an animal when it has kedushas haguf is it's a unique thing regarding animals. Lo nemar pidyon ela behema. You cannot redeem anything else that has kedushas haguf other than a behema. It's dafka behema that has a mum, but no other kedushas haguf can be redeemed through cash. Now, Tzmura is when you're trying to transfer this. This is where you're transferring it onto cash, not when you're trying to transfer it onto another animal.
When you do that in cash,
No, the animal, you're only doing it because the animal's a mum.
Right. So
the animal, the kedusha leaves the animal, goes onto the cash.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yes. So it says the Gemara's today's daf is going to be dealing with the teaching of Shmuel. The Mishnah started off by saying that if you have the flour that you said, not in a kli sharis, but you said, this flour is for a carbon, the halacha is, if it becomes tameh, you could transfer the holiness onto cash, because it's not yet kedushas haguf. Here's the question. That's fair, that we agree with. The question is, can I transfer it onto cash when there is no tameh? Meaning, I say this flour is to be for a carbon, not in a kli sharis, as kedushas damim. Can I then transfer it onto cash? The Mishnah said if it's tameh, I could. Now I get if it's tameh, you could, because you can't use it anymore. What if it's totally usable? It's good flour. I want to transfer it onto cash. Whatever reason, I want to use this flour for myself. Says the Shmuel, afilu hein tahorim nifadim. Rabbi Shmuel says you could transfer the holiness onto cash from flour before it's in a kli sharis, even if it's still tahor. My timer, what's the reason? As long as it's not placed in a kli sharis, kedushas damim ninu. It only has monetary holiness. Kedushas damim nipadim, and kedushas damim is able to be transferred. So Shmuel's mechadish that you could take perfectly good flour and take the kedusha off of it. Look at Shmuel's shita. Now here's the question. Doesn't the Mishnah say you could do this when it becomes tameh? Doesn't that imply, if you read the Mishnah, it says, ha-menachos shenitmu. Isn't the implication of the Mishnah you could only do this process when it's tameh, not when it's perfectly usable? Says the Gemara, nitmu tzanam, but doesn't the Mishnah say tameh? So the Gemara says, hu hadin dafagav deloy nitmu. The truth is, the halach in the Mishnah is the same whether the flour becomes tameh, whether the flour is not tameh. Both cases you could transfer holiness. So why would the Mishnah say tameh if it doesn't have to be tameh? Says the Gemara, the kavay misni seifa, because the reason why it says tameh is for the seifa of the Mishnah. The seifa is a chiddush. It had to say tameh, so just to keep the flow going, it said the ratio. What's the seifa? The next case is that once it's in kidshu b'kli, once it's placed in a kli sharis, ein lahem pidyon. There is no pidyon if it's tameh. Meaning, the seifa of the Mishnah is a chiddush. once it's placed in a kli shares, even though it's tamei and it's not usable anymore, you still cannot be makadosh it. So it had to mention tumah for the seifa, so it mentioned tumah for the reisha. But the truth is, before it's in a kli shares, you could transfer the holiness onto cash, even if it's not yet tamei. The reason why I mentioned tumah is because the next case, once it's placed in a kli shares, you're not able to transfer it, even though it's tamei. It's not usable. You have to just dispose of it. Says the Gemara, I think by Mrs. Seifa, Mishakidshu b'kli ein lam pidyon. The Mishnah then said, once it's placed in a kli shares, even if it's tamei, there is no pidyon. Dafilu nitmu nami lo, and therefore that's the chiddush. So tana nami reisha nitmu. So it said the reisha nitmu as well, even though the real ikar, the reason why I mentioned nitmu, is for the seifa. Now, meaning the ikar chiddush of the Mishnah is that once you place the flour in a kli shares, you cannot transfer the holiness onto cash, even if it becomes tamei. Says the Gemara, isn't that pashit? That's such a chiddush. Mitchekitshu b'kli ein lam pidyon pshita. Kedushas haguf nenu. Isn't that pashut that you're not able to transfer the holiness? It's once it's in a kli shares, it has kedushas haguf. I thought you generally cannot transfer the holiness of kedushas haguf. So says the Gemara, I'll tell you the chiddush. Let me say this outside. It's a little bit flawed because the Mefarshim are bothered. The flow of the Gemara is a little bit hard to understand. But let me just.
When you place in a kli shares,
Yeah.
automatically the whole object becomes
Yes.
kedushas haguf?
Yes. So it says the Gemara like this. The chiddush, again, we're right now saying the chiddush of the Mishnah is that when you place the flour in a kli shares, even though it's tamei, you cannot transfer the holiness onto cash. So it says the Gemara, isn't that pasha? Once it's placed in a kli shares, of course you can't. I'll tell you the chiddush. What about by an animal like this? Let's say an animal were to become tamei, a behema. Could you transfer holiness onto cash? Now you're going to ask yourself for a second, how does a living animal become tamei? It really can't. So it says the Gemara like this. When the pasuk describes transfer the holiness onto cash of an animal when it has a mum, for whatever reason, the Torah does not say mum, it says tamei. So you might think that tamei is a possibility to transfer the holiness because the description of transferring the holiness by a behemoth, it says the word tamei. Chiddush is kamash v'lo no. The tamei in the pasuk is not actual tamei. It's not tumah because there is no tumah on a living animal. The tamei of the pasuk is a balmum. So the Mishnah had to say that if you have flour, even though it becomes tamei, you can't transfer the holiness onto cash. You might think that because the source of transfer the holiness is a description of the word tamei. Now in the pasuk by animals, it's not referring to tamei. So you might think that by here it is referring to tamei. Kamash v'lo no. Tumah is not something you can transfer. Once it's in a kli shares, you can't transfer holiness onto cash by a tumah. Says the Gemara. Exactly, he agrees. Itzrich, you might think, Sal Kedai Tachamina, Itzrich, the Chiddush is like follows. Exactly. A living animal cannot become tamei. We'll talk about it. You might think hoyil ubal mum ikri tamei because when the pasuk describes transfer the holiness from an animal, it says the word tamei. So tamei nami kabal mum dami. So you might think that tuma is a legitimate reason to transfer the holiness. V'da'afa gav the kadosh shaguf kinaf be mum mifrik hakanami mifrik kamash v'la no. The Mishnah is telling me not like that. The lavki hai tamei kari rachman l'bal mum to mekli sharis la'eshkich in the mifrik. I'll tell you why you can't. By an animal, would you be able to transfer the holiness onto cash after tumah? So you'll say to yourself, well, living animals can't become tamei. What's the only time where an animal can become tamei? After it was already in a kli shares. Meaning, let's say you shech the animal, which is the knife, is a kli shares. So after the kli shares, then it becomes tamei. Could you transfer the holiness onto cash? Of course not. If an animal becomes tamei when it's a carbon after it's shechted, you dispose of it. So the point is, we don't find, although the pasuk describes it as tumah, tumah itself is not a legitimate reason to transfer holiness onto cash by an animal, because I'll tell you why. When it's living, there is no tumah. When it's dead, it's too late. So although the pasuk describes transferring the holiness of a balmum, and it doesn't say balmum, it says tumah, tumah means balmum, but tumah is not a legitimate excuse. Now the Gemara will actually say, what is the source? You just told me that the source of transfer the holiness onto cash by a behema, when it has a mum, again, I'm makdish this cow, and then I realize, oh, it cuts its leg off, I got to transfer holiness. The pasuk never says mum, it says tumah. So it says the Gemara, what's the source for this? Ubal mum heich dikri tami. What's the source? Tanya. It says in the pasuk, v'im kol behemat tmeya asher lo yakrivu mimenu karban laHashem. That if you have a behemat tmeya and you're no longer able, and you can't bring it as a karban, transfer holiness onto cash. Now let me ask you a question. Simple person, a little kid comes over and he says, what's a behemat tmeya? A behemat tmeya to me is a chazer. Behemoth Tmeya means a non-kosher animal. So the simple reading of this pasuk is when it says Tameh, it doesn't mean spiritual impurity, and it doesn't mean a mum. It means a chazer. Behema Tamei is a chazer. So it sounds like from the pasuk that if I'm makdish a chazer as a carbon, I transfer the holiness onto cash. The problem is that the pshat of the pasuk? Says the Gemara, no. Bibali mum and shenifta hakas medaber. It's talking about a kosher animal that has a mum, and it calls it tameya. For whatever reason. Says the Gemara, Ata mir bali mum sheniftu. Ayedel behema tameya mamish. Maybe it means a chazer. Kishuoyim, there's another pasuk. The other pasuk says, Behim behema atameya upade berkecha. The other pasuk says that if you're makdish a chazer, you transfer holiness onto cash. So this pasuk cannot be referring to the same thing. And by the way, if you actually look at the pasuk, it makes sense. The pasuk says, Im kol behemat meya, whatever that means. Asher lo yakrivu mimenu karban laHashem. Would the pasuk have to tell me I can't bring a chazer as a karban? Of course not. It's obvious. It must be referring to an animal that is eligible, but it became ineligible due to a mum. Hare behemat tameya mura haman mekayim kol behemat tamah b'mali mum and shenif denakasam adabers. The pasuk is referring to a kosher animal that has a mum, and you transfer holiness onto cash. Now the Gemara just clarifies yachol yiftu a mum over. Maybe what if it has a temporary blemish? You go to the vet, and the vet said, "Oh, it's just a scratch. It'll heal in a week." Maybe during that week, while it still has the blemish, does that mean that it's a bal mum that you could transfer holiness onto cash? No. Only an animal that's ineligible as a carbon. But because this animal will heal, it is eligible as a carbon. You cannot transfer the holiness onto cash because it's not considered a proper mum unless it's a permanent mum, not a temporary blemish. Now, so the Gemara. No, not at all.
So an animal that is coming because of a mum or whatever, that animal you could be kosher.
Correct. Now here's the question. What we're going to be dealing with till the end of today's daf is Shmuel Shita. Shmuel Shita is that when I have flour that's Kedushas Damim, it's not a carbon, it's Kedushas Dam before a Klishares, I'm able to transfer the holiness onto cash even though there's no Tumah. It's perfectly good flour. It's tahar mamish. I'm able to transfer. Is that true? So the Gemara has today's daf is challenging because it's kashas that are sort of roundabout. The Gemara says like this. Let's go to our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said there are 4 examples. Ha'ifus, birds. Ha'etzim, wood. Ha'lavaina, frankincense. Ukli shares, shenitmu, that become tameh. The halach is ein lahem pidyon. They don't have a pidyon. Now, why not? We didn't really talk about it in the Mishnah, but why not? So I told you that once something's in a klishares, it doesn't have a pidyon. But these things are not in a klishares. These things are before a klishares. The frankincense is in a bowl, not in a bowl. It's in a bag. I show up with frankincense. It's in a bag, and I say it has kedushas damim, and it becomes tameh. I can't transfer the holiness onto cash. Why not? It's not even a klishares yet. So I'll tell you outside. We'll see it inside. The Gemara says it must be that even though these items are tameh, it's as if they're tahar. For whatever reason, we treat them as if they're tahar, and you can't transfer the holiness on something that's tahar. And this is not like Shmuel. Shmuel said that if you have flour that's not in a klishares, you're able to transfer holiness while it's tahar. These items, although they're tameh, they're halachically as if they're tahar. And that's why you can't transfer the holiness. It must be that when an item's tahar, you can't transfer the holiness. Why are these items as if they're tahar when they're tameh? We'll get to in a second. But the only way to explain why these items cannot be transferred, the holiness, onto cash, they're not in a klishares yet. Frankincense is in a bag. I have a bag of frankincense and it becomes tameh, I can't transfer the holiness. Why not? It's not in a klishares yet. It's kedushas damim, so why can't I do it? And it's tameh. The answer is, although these items are tameh, we treat them as if they're tahar, for whatever reason. In a second, we'll get to that. And you see that when an item is tahar, you can't transfer holiness onto cash. That's the only explanation. Says the Gemara, let's see it inside. Let's go through each one. The birds, they're already kedushas aguf. So birds, because they're like a carbon, I understand why you can't transfer the holiness, because birds are kedushas aguf, and the only kedushas aguf that you're able to transfer holiness onto cash is a behema, not a bird. Fine, birds are out. These items are not in a klishares. It's a piece of wood. It's not a klishares. I bring a block of wood for the Beis Hamikdash, and it becomes tameh. I can't transfer holiness onto cash. Why not? Says the Gemara, Elalav. Mishum de tahirin ba'alma ein niftin. It must be Shmuel's wrong. Normally, you cannot transfer holiness onto cash of something that's tahar. These items are tameh. Hanami afal gav de nitbu ketarim dami. Even though these items are technically tameh, it's as if they're tahar. And a tahar item cannot be transferred. Why are these items as if they're tahar? Says the Gemara. The reason why these items are considered tahar even when they're tameh is because, let's go through, the wood and the frankincense are not edible. Normally an item to become eligible to be tumah, it has to be food or a kli. A piece of wood and frankincense are not food, and they're not kalim. So they're really not eligible for tumah. The reason why they're eligible to become tameh is because they're so chashiv, because they're dedicated, as they're set aside for the Beis Hamikdash. That's a chashivus that it becomes eligible to tumah. However, the pieces of wood, as long as they're not trimmed to the proper size, loy miskashri, they're not eligible. Therefore, even when they're tameh, it's as if they're tahar because they're not really eligible for tumah. And levoina nami kamad lekitcha b'kli sharis loy miskashra. Kli sharis nami hoyel ve'islu tahar b'mikvah. So you have the wood is not really eligible because it's not of the proper size. The frankincense it's not food, so it's not really placed in a kli sharis, so it's not really eligible for tumah. And a kli sharis, because it can go to the mikvah, the tumah is removable. It's as if the tumah is not here. What do you see by these three? These three items, the only way to explain why you can't redeem it, although they're tameh right now, we don't really see the tumah as real. The tumah is sort of floating above. It's as if they're tahar. And you see, tahar items cannot be redeemed. So according to Shmuel, you could redeem items that are tahar. So why can't I redeem this frankincense? The answer is, it's tameh. It says it's not a real tumah because it's not really eligible for tumah, so it's as like it's tahar. And you can't redeem things that are tahar, not like Shmuel. Not like Shmuel. So it's a right, not like Shmuel. Because Shmuel said that when an item is tahar, you could transfer the holiness. These items became tameh. The answer is, it's not a real tumah, so it's kind of tahar. So why can't I transfer the holiness? Shmuel's wrong. So says the Gemara, no.
The way we answered the Mishnah was saying the tameh was just for the flow. So this goes against that.
Correct. This is not like Shmuel. This is not like Shmuel's Yisod. So the Gemara says, loy lamei melach tayrim ba'al meniftin v'hani mishum d'leishchichu. The answer is no. Shmuel's right. In general, if an item is tahar, you could transfer the holiness onto cash. So how come these items you can't? The answer is, it's like they're tahar. So what? These are the exceptions, not the rule. I'll tell you why. If you have flour is very easy to find. So if I dedicate a bowl of flour, a bag of flour, as kedushas hadamim, and then I want to transfer the holiness onto cash, Shmuel's right, you could. It's tahar, so what? You'll get other flour. Frankincense is hard to find. Wood that's that size, and we'll talk about in a second, it's hard to find. So if it's tahar, Chazal say don't transfer the holiness onto cash. Meaning, Chazal will allow you to transfer the holiness onto a cash of an item that is very, very plentiful. But an item that's hard to find, we don't want you to. So if I show up with a bag of frankincense that's tahar, even Shmuel would say I can't transfer the holiness onto cash. Why not? Because frankincense is hard to find. And if you start doing that, then the Beis Hamikdash is not going to have enough product. So these items, because they're hard to find, they're the exceptions, not the rule.
When we transfer from a behemoth, we leave it in the diet.
Correct.
These things you can't.
I'm just going to eat them, whatever. Frankincense, I'll transfer holiness onto cash, and I want to just use the frankincense in the bathroom for a nice smell. I don't know, whatever.
But you can't, the animal that you transfer from, you can't use.
Correct. Well, it has a mum. I can eat it. It has a mum. Well, it's a mum. Yeah, I could eat it. I have certain restrictions, but you could eat it, you'll have it for dinner. So it says the Gemara, generally you're able to transfer the holiness onto cash of a tahar item. But these items Chazal did not allow because they're not plentiful, and we don't want you to transfer the holiness onto cash because then the Beis Hamikdash is going to run low on product. Says the Gemara, wait a minute, frankincense I get is hard to find. Wood is so hard to find. Go to the tree and chop a wood. So the answer is, says the Gemara, why is wood hard to find? The answer is Eitzim Nami, Kivin Damar Mar Kol Eitz Shenimtza Boy Teilas Pasal Gam Mizbeach Hilgal Ishchichi. If there's even one worm in the wood is not eligible. It's apparently very hard to find that high quality wood to bring for the Beis Hamikdash. And because it's hard to find, Chazal did not allow you to transfer the holiness onto cash. Says the Gemara Rav Papa said, wait a minute. We're dealing with Shmuel Shita that if you have Kedushas Damim, you could transfer the holiness onto cash. I'm going to stop saying those words, transfer poida. You could be poida, which is transfer the holiness onto cash. It's easier for me to say. You could be poida even when it's not tameh, even when it's tahar. You could be poida. That's Shmuel Shita. Says the Gemara, Rav Papa, Ishmile Shmuel Hadatanya. If Shmuel had seen this following brisa, he would reverse his Shita. What does the brisa say? The brisa says, Hamatvis Tamimim Lebedek Habayis. Let's say you have an animal. Generally, when you have a full-fledged cow that's eligible for a carbon and you give it kedusha, you're supposed to dedicate it as a carbon. And when you have a horse, which is not a carbon, you don't dedicate that as a carbon, you dedicate that as the Beis Hamikdash's product, bedek habayis. If I go over to a cow and I say, this is for the bedek habayis, that's not a good thing to do because the bedek habayis doesn't need cows. The karbanos are needed for, the Beis Hamikdash needs cows, not the bedek habayis. So bedek habayis is for the upkeep. It's just basically a general donation. So if I say that a cow is holy as the bedek habayis, the halacha is, Ein podin osa el mizbeach. You could redeem it, but here's what you do. You could only transfer the holiness onto cash if you find someone who needs a carbon. Meaning normally when I transfer the holiness onto cash, I have a cow, and I have $100. I say, boom, boom, kedusha is this. Can't do that because it's not so pashut. This is an eligible carbon. So here's the only way you could do it. I find Gavin. I'm like, hey, do you need to bring a cow as a carbon? You're like, yeah. Do me a favor. I have a cow. Your cash, do it. Transfer the holiness and then donate the money. So we're not going to just let you transfer the holiness and let the animal go as steak dinner. You can only do it if the animal will end up being used as a carbon. What do you see here? You see that when an animal is purely eligible, you can't just transfer the holiness onto cash. So too flour. When flour is eligible and it's not tameh, Shmuel's wrong. Meaning Shmuel's whole point is that if I have flour that's eligible as a carbon, eligible for the mincha, it's not tameh, I'm allowed to transfer the holiness onto cash. Yeah, but not by an animal. When an animal is purely healthy, you can't just transfer the holiness onto cash. You got to find someone who still needs it. Well, you got to jump through those hoops. So you see Shmuel's wrong. That's the raya connected Shmuel. Says the Gemara, "Ein poidin olam zimzbech, shekal roilam zimzbech and yotzim v'tei zechel oilam. Avakav kedushas damim ninu. Ein niftam hayol taharimim. Even though this is only kedushas damim, you can't just be poided because it's an eligible animal. So too over here, this is eligible flour. Have a hadarbe. If Shmuel knew this brisa, he would reverse his shita. So says the Gemara, that's not true. The truth is, Shmuel is aware of that brisa, and the answer is very simple. Flour is much more plentiful than healthy animals. You're able to transfer holiness onto cash by flour because you'll find other flour. But when you have a full-fledged cow that's healthy, that has no mum, no, those are hard to find. You made that as kedushas damim. You can't just transfer holiness onto cash. In other words, Shmuel agrees that not everything is the same. It depends whether the item is very plentiful or it's hard to find. Animals that are purely healthy, that don't have a mum, are hard to find. Says the Gemara, Shmuel's aware of that brisa. He doesn't have to retract his view. Lav amrit hasam kiven de shchichele mifrek hachanami kiven de shchichi moment de pasi b'mehema dafilu beduka shebainami pasi hilkel shchichi. If an animal has a cataract, it's possible. You know how hard it is to find a large animal that has no blemish at all? It's hard to find. It's definitely more hard to find than flour, and therefore he would not allow you to transfer the whole onto cash by a behema, but he would allow it by a flour.
Being very pragmatic with time and top, being saying time and top. So it's like the Messias is the Messias, but we're kind of
the question is whether Chazal would permit it. It's all derabbanans, obviously. Now, so Shmuel started off our discussion by saying that if the flour is kedushas damim before a klisharis and it's tahar, you're able to transfer the holiness. I think actually we talked about other items. Says the Gemara, how do other Amiroyim paskin? Rav Kana Amar Tamei niftu Tarin ein niftu. Rav Kana says I disagree. If it's tahar, you're not able to be poded. V'chein Amar Rav Oshia said the same thing, not like Shmuel. Tamei niftim Tarim ein niftim. But says the Gemara, Ikad Amri, but some have a different version of Rav Oshia. The Amar Rav Oshia feel Tarin nami niftim. So one version of Rav Oshia he disagrees with Shmuel. One version of Rav Oshia he agrees with Shmuel. So it's different versions of Rav Oshia. Now, Rav Elazar Omer, Kulan, one more shita, and then we'll start a new discussion, will take us to the end of the daf. Rav Elazar Omer, Kulan Tameim Niftin, Tarinei Niftin. Rav Elazar says, I normally agree that you're not able to transfer the holiness onto cash of a tahar product, except for the 10th of the ephah of the sinner's minchas flour, which is able to be redeemed. That's the only one. Why? What is that referring to? So Rashi says that's called the carbon oil of yored. Oil of yored means that it depends on. If I have $100. If I could afford an animal, I bring an animal. If I can't afford an animal, I bring a bird. If I can't bring a bird, I bring a flower. What happens if I dedicate the flower as the mincha and then Baruch Hashem I make a little more money? So you know what I do? I take that cash and then I buy an animal with it. What do you see? It's built into the system to be paid it. That's the only mincha where it's built into the system that you have to be able to transfer the holiness onto cash and to buy more animals. So because it's sort of endorsed by the Torah, that's the exception, not the rule. Now, here's what we're going to do. Let me explain outside because it's a little bit tricky. From here, from this point on, which is Amar of Oishia, Shamati, until the end of the daf, it is one flow of consciousness. It is one flow of consciousness that we'll come back to it about, in 5-10 minutes, we'll come back to what we're talking about. Again, Rav Oishia was discussing, can I transfer the holiness onto cash of a flour, perfectly tahar? Can I do that? One version said yes, one version said no. Remember that because we're going to come back to it. Rav Oishia, Shamati, Rav Oishia said, I heard the following thing. Let me give a little bit of a background. food is eligible to be tameh, and it's able to transmit tumah at a size of I think kabeya. So if you have an apple can become tameh, and an apple can transmit tumah. Food can transmit tumah. It has to be food though, right? If it's a paper cup, not a cup is a kli. If I have a piece of a stone's not food, and it's not a kli. It's not able to transmit tumah. What defines food? Food is edible. What happens if I have something that's aser b'hana? Right? Basa b'chalav, right? Or orla. It's aser b'hana. Is that food? Rav Shimon shita is that it's not food. Food is defined by something you could eat. If you can't eat it, it's not food. So it doesn't transmit tumah. It's not eligible to transmit tumah. That's what we're going to be discussing. Says the Gemara, Amar Vayishia, Shamati, I heard pigel b'mincha. If some intended pigel thoughts by mincha, so he does the kmitza thinking pigel thoughts, so now the rest of the mincha is chayiv kares for eating it. So Rav Shimon ain't metama tumas eichlin. According to Rav Shimon, it is not eligible for tumah. Why? Because it's not edible. It's chayiv kares. Pigel's chayiv kares is not edible. Good. Now what this has to do with transferring kedusha, tahara, poida, we'll come back to this. That's what Rabbi says. Now the Gemara says, where's this shita of Rav Shimon? The Tanan ha'arla. Again, Rav Shimon shita is that something that's chayiv, that something that aser b'hana is not edible, is not transmit tumah. The Tanan arla, which is aser b'hana. Klai kerem, klayim. Go to the next page. Also aser b'hana. Shar haniskol, an ox that's condemned to death. Egla arufa, tzipore mitzayra, peter chamar, basar b'chalav. These are all items that are asab hana. Kulam temeim tumas eichlin. The Tanakama believes that they're still food, even though you can't eat it. They're still food. Rav Shimon says kulon ein metama tumas eichlin. I disagree. They're all not eligible because they're all asab hana. There's only one that I think is transmitting tumah, and that's basa b'chalav, because basa b'chalav was eligible at some point. Meaning Rav Shimon says if the item never had an eligibility, a heter to eat, then it's not roy l'tama tumas eichlin. If it had a moment of eligibility, so I'll give you an example. Cup of milk, food, eligible. Steak, eligible. They go together, it's basa b'chalav. Now it's asa b'hana. Well, now it's asa b'hana, but it was eligible at some point. Good. That's Rav Shimon shita. Umayder Rav Shimon basa b'chalav. Shemetama tumas eichlin. Rav Shimon says the only one I agree is metama tumas eichlin is basa b'chalav. However, ha'is l'shas kusha, because it had a moment where it was eligible. That's Rav Shimon shita. Let's keep going. Zok the Gemara. Amar Rav Asi Amar Rav Yochanan. My time with Rav Shimon. What's Rav Shimon's source? That for to transmit tumah, it has to be edible practically, not food. It has to be halachically edible, permissible to eat. The Gemara says mikol ha'ochel asher ye'ochel, because the pasuk describes tumah as mishchol ha'ochel asher ye'ochel. By the way, this is a chiddush, because I would argue food is food. Whether you're allowed to eat the food or not, it doesn't matter. It comes to Shimon. It has to be edible. Why? Because the pasuk says mikol ha'achel asher ye'achel. Asher ye'achel means that you have to be able to practically eat it. Something that's asa b'hana you can't eat. It says the Gemara, oichel shati yochel achil acherim kar oichel shiati yochel acher ein kar oichel. Now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Hapigol b'mincha nami. I'm sorry, this is the end of it. This is not a kasha. This is a pigel. How do we start this discussion for Shimon? Pigel. If I have pigel by a mincha, because it's chayiv kares, it's not eligible, it's not edible, so therefore it's not metama tumas eichlin. Good. Now, by the way, what's your point? What about the fact that it was eligible at some point? Didn't he say by basa b'chalav that it's so as long as it has eligibility? The Gemara will address that in a moment. So wait for that. It's a good question. Says the Gemara, wait a minute, ihachi, a side point. Before we go weiter, what's the one case that he felt has tumas eichlin? Basa b'chalav, because it was eligible. Even though right now it's asa b'hana, but it was eligible. Forget about that. Do you know Rav Shimon shita is that basa b'chalav is not asa b'hana? I didn't know this, but apparently Rav Shimon shita is that basa b'chalav is not asa b'hana. So you can give it to a guy, you could sell it, whatever. So here's the shaila. Why are you saying the basa b'chalav is tuma because it was eligible? Forget about eligibility. It's not asa b'hana. It shouldn't be in the list. So it says the Gemara, ihachi, wait a minute, basa b'chalav nami. Typically the oichel she'at yachal achil acherim. I thought Rav Shimon shita is an asa b'hana. The Tanya. Rav Shimon Yehuda Rav Shimon. Rav Shimon by Yochai holds basa b'chalav asa b'achilu muta b'hana. The basa b'chalav is asa b'achilu, but it's muta b'hana. Obviously we don't pass in that way, as anyone who's done the first sif in sim pei zayin. Shenamar ki am kadosh atal Hashem lekecha loisav. The pasuk says, "Don't eat basa b'chalav." And we know that treifa is not asa b'hana. Rav Shimon looks at basa b'chalav as like treifa, asa b'achila, but muta b'hana. Says the Gemara. So he compares it to treifa. So here's the kasha. So why is basa b'chalav able to be tamei tumas eichlin? Because it was eligible. Forget about eligible. It's not asa b'hana. It doesn't deserve to be in the list. So the Gemara says you're right. You're right. So there's multiple reasons that basa b'chalav is the exception. Meaning, Rav Shimon's saying these are all not tumas eichlin. They're not able to matama because they're all asa b'hana. Basa b'chalav is different. Why? Because it had an eligibility. And it's not asa b'hana. So add that to the list. Okay. So chadav oid kamar chadav oichel shat yachal ilchem va'oid lididei nami ha'isel shas kosher. Good. Here's the question. The question is. And by the way, this is really Gavin's question, and that is, Rav Shimon's whole point, as we're going to establish, is that if it had a moment of eligibility, it is roy l'tama tumas eichlin. So then how come pigel is not matama tumas eichlin? What's pigel? I take flour, I pick it up, and I say, I'm going to burn this tomorrow. It makes the entire thing chayav kares. Now, right now, I can't eat it, but I was able to eat it 10 minutes ago. So why did Rav Shimon say this? So the Gemara gets to this. Meisvei, I have a kasher of Shimon Oimer. Yesh noiser shu matama tumas eichlin. Noiser is when the carbon went past the expiration date. So you have a leg of a carbon. Once it goes past, let's say by a shlomim 2 days and 1 night, it becomes noiser. Is noiser able to matama tumas eichlin? So Rav Shimon said it depends. Did it have a moment of eligibility or not? You could have noiser that had a moment of eligibility. The standard noiser, I have 2 days to eat it, perfectly eligible. Then it goes past the point I no longer could eat it, but it had a moment of eligibility. It is matama tumas eichlin. But you could have noiser that never had a moment of eligibility. What's the case? I shecht a carbon, and I just never do zrika. And I let the zrika, you have 24 hours to do, you have till that night to do zrika. Once dawn comes, it's too late. The carbon is now noiser, but it was never eligible. It never had a moment of eligibility, because when it's alive, it's a living animal you can't eat. When it's dead, it's shechted as a carbon, and it was never hitzrika. So that's noiser that was never eligible. Perfectly makes sense. Says the Gemara, Ketzad, Lon lefnei zrika and matama tumas eichlin. Lachas zrika matama tumas eichlin. Upigel. Now here's the kasha. Pigel. What's the status of pigel? So we said before, pigel is not matama tumas eichlin. Now that's a problem. The truth is, Rav Shimon himself said not like that. What did Rav Shimon say? Pigel bein b'kacha kacha bein b'kacha kalam im tumas eichlin, but pigel b'mincha matama tumas eichlin. Pigel by mincha is matama tumas eichlin because it had a moment of eligibility. So there's a straight up contradiction. So says the Gemara loy kasha. Kancha hoisle hashas kosher, kancha loy hashas kosher. Rav Shimon only said his shita by a mincha that was never eligible. Let me ask you a question. How do you have a mincha that was never eligible? Isn't mincha by definition you show up with flour, which you could eat, and then you say this is a carbon, and then now it's no longer eligible because now it becomes, you start the process and you never made it eligible because you can't eat it when it's a carbon and you did kmitza inappropriately. So here's the question. What is a mincha? It's like a clever idea. It's like a clever chap. Rav Shimon is saying there is a case of mincha being pigel where it's not matama tumas eichlin because it's not edible and it was never eligible to eat. How is flour never eligible to eat? So says the Gemara, the case is you're magdish it when it's still growing from the ground. It was never a moment where it was actually edible because when it was growing from the ground, you were already magdish it. So it was never eligible. Okay, good. That's a clever answer. That answers your question. It was never eligible to eat. It was never edible. It's not like it's flour. Yeah, the standard case is you show up with a bag of flour from your house, which was edible, and you say there's a carbon. No, that's not the case. The case is as it's growing, I say, fine. Here's the kasha, though.
No, so hold on. So therefore, when it's growing from the ground,
I was magdisha when it's growing from the ground, which means I can't eat it when it's growing. The second I cut it, it's still a carbon. I grind it up to flour, it's still a carbon. I show up to the Beis Hamikdash, I do kmitz and I do pigel, so it's not eligible. It was never eligible. Okay. So therefore, it's not matama tumas eichlin. Perfect. Great answer. Let me ask you a question. While it's growing, you say it's not it's not edible. Why? Because it's a carbon. So just redeem it. Just redeem it while it's growing. So what's the answer? The answer is it's not tameh, and you can't just redeem kedushas damim, not like Shmuel. Meaning, if you hold like Shmuel that you could transfer the holiness onto cash of something that's perfectly workable, so you have this flour, this stalks are growing. So you say, oh, it's not edible. Why? Because it's you're magdish. So just why is it not eligible? I could just transfer the holiness onto cash and make it eligible. The answer is you can't. Not like Shmuel. So according to and this is Rav Oishia talking. So if you hold like Rav Oishia if two versions of Rav Oishia. If Rav Oishia holds like Shmuel, if Rav Oishia holds that you can't transfer the holiness when it's tahar, I get it. But if Rav Oishia holds that you could, then why can't I just transfer the holiness? It's a very clever flow. You just have to follow it. Says the Gemara, But even when the grain is growing, why can't you redeem it and make it eligible? And once it's eligible, it should be matama to masaychlin. So says the Gemara, Hanich lahachlisha damar avoshit meint niftin tahirin and niftin shapir. And lahachlisha damar afil tahirin nami niftin lifrakinu. According to the version of Rav Oishia where he holds like Shmuel that you're able to transfer the holiness even on something that's tahar, why can't I do that in this case? So says the Gemara, maybe you could, but hashami loy parik. The answer is you could transfer the holiness, but you have not done that yet. Meaning, you're right. If I had done that, I could. A case is I'm magdish it when it's growing. If I wanted to at that moment, Rabbi Yishai holds I could transfer the holiness onto cash, but I didn't. So it was practically inedible. It's growing inedible, and then I grind it up inedible, and I bring it as pigel inedible. I could, but I didn't. Who cares that I could? So says the Gemara, whoa. The Gemara says, "V'kivan di boy parikle shaminul Rav Shimon damar kol oim liftes kipadis dami." Doesn't Rav Shimon himself? And we'll end with this. You're telling me that just because I could, but I didn't yet. Yeah, but Rav Shimon's shita is that if you could redeem it, it makes it edible in halacha, even if you didn't yet. What's the example? Para aduma. I have a para aduma. I shech the para aduma outside. I'm about to burn it. It becomes tameh. You know what Rav Shimon says? It's able to transfer the whole. It's able to matama to masaychlin. Wait a minute. Rav Shimon's sheet of Tamatum Asaychlin means that it had to have a moment of edibility. Were you ever able to eat a paraduma? When it's alive, no, it's a living animal. And then I shechted it as a paraduma. So when was I ever able to? The answer is Rav Shimon holds that because you could transfer the holiness onto cash before you burn it, Rav Shimon's sheet is that if you have a paraduma, until you burn it, you could redeem it. So the very fact that you could redeem it makes it edible. That's the only way to explain that. So how come by the flower growing, the stalks are growing, I'm magdish it, oh, it's not edible. Why? But I thought you could redeem it according to one version of Aisha. The answer is, yeah, but you didn't redeem it yet. Yeah, but so what? But the very fact that you can makes it edible, as we find by paraduma. We'll end with this, the Tanya of Shimon Omer, para mitama tumas oichlin. If you shech the paraduma, it's able to transmit tuma. Wait a minute, it was never eligible. Because there was a moment of edibility. When was it edible? Says the Gemara. Because Rav Shimon holds, after you shech the paraduma, before you burn it, that moment you could redeem it. And because you could redeem it, it makes it edible. So what do you see? You see that the very fact that you can redeem it makes it edible. So how come, if you hold that you could redeem flour when it's tahar, so that should make it edible? So every case of a mincha should have a moment of edibility. And don't tell me this was never edible because you were magdish when it was growing. But the very fact that you can redeem it according to one version of Rashi, you're able to redeem it, although it's tahar, that makes it edible. So says the Gemara, what's the difference? So how come by a paraduma, the fact that you can be poided makes it edible, but by this mincha, the fact that you can be poided, it's not edible? What's the difference? And we'll end with this. The Gemara says, Hachi hashta, bishloima para, oimedis liftasi. Paraduma, it's not that you can, you're supposed to. Do you know that if you shecht a paraduma, and then you find a better looking paraduma, you're supposed to be poided. I don't know why you can't just use both, but you're supposed to be poided and use the other one. We don't find that by flour. So it's not whether you can, it's whether you should. Really, Rav Shimon Ketaka hold, like Rav Oishia Ketaka hold like Shmuel, that you could transfer the holiness onto cash when it's tahar. So when it's growing, you could be transfer the holiness. You could be poided. So why is it not have a shas kosher? Why isn't it edible? Why isn't it metama tumas oichlin? You could. The answer is, by paraduma, you're supposed to. That's the chilik. The Gemara says, Oimedis liftasi, it's meant to be redeemed. Shematza acheres na'imenu, because if you find another paraduma that's nicer looking, mitzvah liftoso. So because it's meant to be paida, it's keilu you were already paida and had a moment of eligibility. Elihacha hashta, when it comes to flour, mitzvah liftosa. Is there a mitzvah to be paida? No. So the very fact that it can is not enough, and until you're actually paida, it's not considered edible. All right, we'll stop here. We'll pick it up.
Good.